Do you think the disagreement also extends to the frozen Iranian assets, or is there already some level of understanding between the two sides? And how critical is that issue to whether negotiations move forward or stall?
I can't I can't say for sure right now where things stand. And after Trump spoke yesterday, I don't know if what sort of communications have been going back and forth since then. But as I said earlier, there was a broad agreement about a deal. Now, for the Iranians, the financial issue, which is stolen Iranian money, it's no gift. And when Trump spoke about Trump giving $1 billion or I don't know, $1.9 billion in cash to Iran, he wasn't doing Iran any favors. That was confiscated Iranian money. That was stolen Iranian money. I mean, it's not as if they pretend as if they're giving us gifts. They steal our stuff, and then Iran forces them to give a bit of it back, and then they pretend as if they're doing us a big favor. And this is the money of the 90 million people. But in any case, I don't know where it stands right now, the tax, where things are, but the Iranians, a key issue for the Iranians is the transfer of Iran's wealth. Because the Americans, as we've seen so many times, they'll write down something on paper, but then they won't implement. So the Iranians are saying, look, we don't want to go, we're not going to accept, again, the United States writing something down and then saying, oh, we couldn't do it for this legal reason or that technical reason. So the Iranians want to make sure that the Americans, as I said earlier, that they carry out their obligations. So there are two problems, major problems. One is we have to see if the Americans come to an agreement, because Trump, every day he says something different. And what he says is very different from what his negotiators are writing down on paper. At least last time I heard. And the second is, of course, the issue of implementation. The Americans have a very bad history when it comes to implementation. They're deceitful, they're dishonest, and it's not just Trump. Different administrations have always been that when it comes to Europe.
We're seeing unusually strong language from a senior Iranian negotiator, emphasizing pressure over dialogue, actions over promises, and preparedness for war, even in the context of agreements. That suggests a fundamental shift in tone and expectations on the Iranian side. Does this mean Tehran no longer sees negotiations as a path to resolution, but rather as part of a broader strategy alongside preparation for conflict?
Well, Nima, Ayatollah Khamenei, before his martyrdom, has always been telling Iranians that you're strong, you're powerful. He was always very confident about the capabilities of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the entire axis of resistance. And he created a generation, or not multiple generations, of people who had that confidence. Generations of people in Iran were taught by him to have confidence. And I'm just making up this number. But let's say half the country believed that we would win this war from the very beginning. Again, I'm just guessing. I don't know, but I would imagine something like that. I don't think it's a completely inaccurate number. And the other half of the country was nervous. But after a few days, those who were nervous became more confident. And they saw that we were actually defeating the superpower and its allies, with all the power and all the wealth and everything that they brought in, and the funding from even these regimes in the Persian Gulf who were assisting them in this war. Iran was winning the war. And that self-confidence is, I think, reflected in today's society. People are not, they ask, is there going to be war, not war, but not like before. Before, there was like, many were worried. Now it's like, some say, well, we should have war. Not everyone says that, but some say, let's go, we should just finish them off. You see that a lot. But I think the government is doing the right thing to negotiate, to see if there's a solution. But there is a very, a strong degree of confidence. And what Dr. Ghalibaf says, and I think he was one of those who was confident from the very beginning, but it resonates. It says a lot about Iranian society. People say, yes, this is exactly how our negotiators should speak when dealing with Americans, not when dealing with friends. We have many friends across the world, but the Americans are not our friends. I mean, the Trump regime, the elites, not ordinary Americans. They're not the problem. They're victims, just like everyone else. So yes, it's a tough statement, and I think it shows that the state and the different branches of government and the political establishment are sending a message to the United States that this is not the JCPOA, where you just wear us down, or where we're going to show excessive or too much patience or too much flexibility. I believe that in the nuclear deal, we did show too much flexibility. And in the past, because we did not want war, our response to their aggression, murdering General Soleimani, the bombing of our embassy in Syria, in Damascus, and so on. Our responses were more cautious because we didn't want regional instability. But now we've reached a point where we say, okay, enough is enough. We are powerful. People recognize the country's power, the power of the resistance, the axis of resistance, and it's reflected in the statement of the chief negotiator. That sense of confidence about our righteousness and about our strength and about us being on the right side of the moral issues of the day, supporting the oppressed against the oppressor. So I think it's an important statement, and it is a statement that is resonating in a very positive way among ordinary Iranians.
On Lebanon, we understand Iran's position and the role Hezbollah is playing on the ground, especially with its ability to strike back despite Israel's defenses. The question is whether Tehran sees any signs that the Trump administration is willing to pressure Israel to de-escalate. So do you think Iran believes Washington can or will actually push for an end to the fighting in Lebanon?
Well, first I have to, I have to say that what Hezbollah is doing is extraordinary. Not only are they fighting in a very sophisticated way, but against all odds. You have these Takfiri monsters in Syria who are proxies of the United States, and all those who pretended that they were the Syrian people, and they were proxies of the United States, and those who supported them enabled the United States to take Syria, and they weakened the Palestinian cause. And they can pretend that Hezbollah or Iran, what they did in Syria was wrong. No, what they did was absolutely right. It had nothing to do with religion or sectarianism. It had to do with fighting and resisting against the CIA and the empire. The CIA was doing everything it could for the Israeli regime, and these people assisted the Israeli regime. And those who continue to pretend that it's anything different from that, they're still assisting the Israeli regime, even if they pretend that they support Palestine. Or maybe they do support Palestine, but in their blindness, and willful blindness, they pretend that the reality is different from what it really is. So Hezbollah to the east is surrounded by Al-Qaeda and ISIS, American proxies. The regime in Beirut, which was installed by the Americans, installed by force. The regime is a proxy of the United States. And then you have the Israeli regime. They're surrounded. And many in Lebanon are bought off. The dictatorships in the Persian Gulf, they're funding groups against the resistance. And of course, the Americans and the Europeans have all these NGOs. And so the resistance is fighting against this very complicated, complex situation. Within the context of this very complicated situation, And they're defeating the enemy. They're defeating the most brutal and ruthless enemy too on this planet. That in revenge, they take down apartment blocks and slaughter women and children. They don't care about women and children. We know who they are. We saw what they did in Gaza and what they're doing in Gaza. The genocide in Gaza is picking up steam again. But you won't know this if you watch CNN or the BBC or read The Guardian or read the New York Times or anything like that. So Hezbollah is the hero of the heroism of Hezbollah is unique. And that's why they're a household name. And they've made these sacrifices for the sake of the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people, during these years they've been defending themselves, Hezbollah has been assisting other people and making sacrifices. They knew that the Israelis would bomb their families. They knew that they would slaughter their women and children in revenge. But they still fought in order to draw troops away from Gaza. These are a unique people. A unique people. People across the globe should have the utmost respect for their martyrs and for their families and for all those who made such sacrifices. The women, they have made enormous sacrifices to support the combatants. But that aside, there will be no deal until the slaughter ends and there's a regional ceasefire and an end to the war. There will be no deal. So we'll wait. If the Americans want to destroy the global economy, it's up to them. If Netanyahu and the Zionists are determined to destroy the global economy so that they can have the right to slaughter women and children, no, that's not going to happen. So there's an agreement on the table. Already Netanyahu has blocked it once, because after the 39 days or so of fighting, when the Americans lost the war, and we had a ceasefire, it was agreed that Iran would allow ships. Remember, again, I've said this before, the Strait of Hormuz has never been closed. Ships that belong to countries that were not waging war against Iran or were not complicit in the war were always allowed to pass through. So only those regimes that were assisting in the assault on the Iranian people, whose ships were blocked, only their ships were blocked. Kuwait, the Emirates, so on, the Europeans, whoever. But in the ceasefire agreement, the Iranians were going to allow those ships to go through. And Netanyahu blocked it by carpet bombing Lebanon. So this was 50 days ago or so. Yeah, 50 days ago. Imagine what the global economy could have been right now, where we could have been, where people across the world could have been if Netanyahu had allowed it, if the Zionists had allowed it. But Trump, being a weak and feeble leader and totally corrupt, and I'm sure compromised. I mean, I can't imagine really him being compromised, not being a part of the issue, the problem. But in any case, because of these people, the world is now suffering immensely. And unless the Americans accept and enforce a halt to the genocide and accept a ceasefire and an end to the hostilities, then there won't be an agreement. Not only for moral considerations, not only because the people of Lebanon deserve to live. I mean, what the Americans want and what the West wants and is that Iran says, let them, you can have your ceasefire and you can have your ships leave the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians can do trade, but let the Israelis slaughter the Lebanese. No, that's not going to happen. This shows how morally bankrupt the West is, Western elites. Utterly immoral. But beyond that, there's also another issue. If Iran allows the other side to refrain from implementing its obligations in an agreement, in one case, they'll do it again and again and again. If the Americans think that, okay, the Iranians have set like these 5 conditions for the Strait of Hormuz to be open, let's not do number 1. Let's not implement number 2. Let's not carry out our obligations in number 3. If they do it and they get away with it, then they'll go on and say, well, let's do another and another. Let's keep violating the deal and see how much we can get. So the Iranians, and this is what happened in the JCPOA. This is exactly what happened in 2015. The Iranians carried out all of their obligations because they abide by their commitments. And the Americans under Obama, not Trump, Obama cheated Iran every step of the way. And the Iranians, President Rouhani was too cautious, and that only made things worse. Now the Iranians are saying, no, we have a deal, you abide by that deal. You don't abide by that deal, we don't have a deal. So that's why, as I said earlier, there's a widespread belief in Iran that among people who are involved in the decision-making process, that even if an agreement is signed, it doesn't mean an end to the war. It doesn't even mean that it'll last for 2 months. It could fall apart in 2 weeks. That's where we are now.
We've seen a chain of escalation, attacks on Iranian assets, reported strikes on Bandar Abbas, and then Iran responding with hits on a U.S. base in Kuwait, including drone losses and injuries. At the same time, Iranian officials are framing the blockade as another breach of trust, turning it into an issue of national dignity rather than just economics. Does this shift make escalation almost inevitable? And how far could Iran go in responding to what it sees as repeated provocations?
Well, first of all, even Bloomberg, we should take anything that they say with a big pile of salt. And and throughout this war, they've been lying. They're always intercepting the missiles and drones, and then after the war, we learned that everything's been destroyed. But all the missiles and drones were being intercepted. So it's all deceit. And even when Bloomberg says 2 very expensive drones were badly damaged or destroyed, and 5 soldiers were injured, you can imagine that it was probably a lot worse than that. But for the Iranians, you're right. I mean, again, this is something that we discussed a couple of times in the past. The Iranians are very like Hezbollah. The culture of resistance and dignity and rejecting humiliation is very strong in Iranian culture. In a couple of weeks, we're going to pretty soon from now, it's going to be Muharram, the month of Muharram. And in the month of Muharram, Imam Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet, the Holy Prophet, was martyred in Karbala, and his sister and his companions, we know the story. People, they should read about it, not from Western sources, but and they'll understand where this resilience comes from. And Imam Hussein, his rejection of any form of humiliation is something that resonates among all Iranians. I mean, you're Iranian, you know that in Iran, you have people who are not religious. They drink and they dance and they just, but even when it comes to Ashura and Tasur, almost all of these people too become a part of all the ceremonies and the events on the day before and on the day of Tasur, the 9th, and on Ashura, the 10th, where Imam Hussein was martyred. So this sense of resilience and this steadfastness and this idea of standing up to oppression and to support the oppressed and to reject being, someone once said on a different show, a young man said to me, we should support Iran because they're oppressed. And I didn't say anything out of respect for the young man. But, Iran doesn't feel oppressed. Iran feels that, they're steadfast and defiant. Hezbollah is not oppressed. They don't feel oppressed. They feel steadfast and defiant. They're struggling and fighting oppression, not just on their own behalf, but on behalf of the Palestinian people and others. So this thousands of years of civilization combined with this, this sense of resilience and dignity is what defeated the United States. It is this self-confidence that made the young Iranians develop missiles and drones and devise a military doctrine that was able to defeat the superpower and its allies and its proxies. It is a combination of all of these together. I mean, these factors gave that self-confidence to Iranian generals, to young scientists, men and women, to enhance Iran's technological capabilities. And by the way, many female scientists are part of these programs to develop Iran's military and technological capabilities. So again, I think it goes back to a complete lack of understanding of Iran in the West and the axis of resistance. I mean, look at Hezbollah right now. It's just amazing how they can. I mean, it's not even like Hamas. Hamas, I mean, at least they controlled Gaza. Hezbollah doesn't control Lebanon. The government of Lebanon is as treacherous as the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, if not more so, much more so. And a portion of the population in Lebanon is allied to the Israeli regime. They're in bed with the Israeli regime. They assisted the Israeli regime in 1982 when they occupied Lebanon. They helped, and the Israelis went in the Palestinian camp of Sabra and Shatila. They slaughtered 3,000 men, women, and children in literally like 24 hours with Israeli supervision. You have these people in them, but despite that, you see how resilient and steadfast the resistance is. This is a culture that I mentioned this on your show before. I think even last time. Alistair Crook's book, Resistance, is a good read. I think people should read it. I think people should buy it and read it and have others read it to better understand where this resistance and resilience comes. And of course, this is something that people across the world know very little about. But in reality, the most effective resistance against empire ever comes from here. And it's not without reason that the godfather of the neocons, Robert Kagan, says that this was the biggest U.S. defeat ever. First time the U.S. was defeated in war on the battlefield. I mean, they went and occupied Iraq, and thanks to General Soleimani and his companions, they failed in Afghanistan. Again, very much thanks to General Soleimani and his companions, they failed, because we have big disagreements with the Taliban about women, about education, about freedoms, and so on. But the U.S. occupation was a threat to everyone. And General Soleimani began cooperating with them, and they did evolve to a degree, the Taliban. They're not like what they were 20, although we have big differences. But they have evolved to a degree. But thanks to Iran, the Americans were forced. But this was different than Iraq and Afghanistan. Here they were defeated on the battlefield. And it wasn't just the United States that brought in everything it had. It was the Israeli regime, and it was all these rich Arab dictatorships that with all their wealth, and then the European Union and everyone sanctioning Iran, condemning Iran. And they failed. Not through like years of occupation, they failed on the battlefield. So there's a lot that people have to learn about the axis of resistance. And the more they learn, the more their countries will be capable of being defended. They'll be more capable in defending their countries against them.
You mentioned earlier that time may be working in Iran's favor, while the U.S. seems to be shifting from high-intensity conflict to a more prolonged, low-intensity approach. At the same time, Gulf states appear to be under increasing pressure, with measures like swap lines now coming into play. How do you interpret this shift, And why are these financial mechanisms like swap lines becoming so significant in this context?
Well, you're in Europe, and as I understand it, the Europe economy is being squeezed just as the U.S. economy is being squeezed. Already the rise in oil prices is forcing many families, many wage earners, many employers, and many industries into debt, and the government has been trying to cope with this by giving some subsidies for homeowners and renters and just the population at large to be able to live with this. There's been a wholesale drop of sale of the U.S. and of petroleum reserves and the petroleum reserves of other countries, saying, well, maybe we can just run down these reserves for a rainy day. This is a rainy day. What they don't realize is this is a rainy year, or this is a rainy 2 years, that it's not a day after which the oil reserves can be filled up. The Europe and the United States are following a form of desperation to deal with this. Well, how long can the reserves last? The estimates are 30 to 45 days, and then they run out. And then there's no way of continuing the subsidy of budgets of people who drive cars, who use electricity, of trucks, who use diesel fuel, of airlines, who use air fuel. All of this is going to run out. So time is on the side both of Iran and Russia and China in this. They can the Western economies are self-destructing, especially in Europe with Germany, where you have the German leaders and the European leaders in general say we have to be part of this new war. It's the last war that we have to win World War II for the German European side. It's the last time we have to fight Russia because we're getting weaker and weaker, and it's never going to be as less bad a time as it is right now. And so we have to use our national budgets to subsidize a war industry, not our regular commercial industries, not our consumers and wage earners. And this is going to create the same revulsion among voters that it's created in Britain, which I think it seems to be the most desperate economy right now, where you have Britain turn to the essentially libertarian policies, the anti-war policies, just as Germany is trying to ban the Alternative for Deutschland party. Essentially, they say any party that is against the war is against civilization. This war to destroy our countries that America says are our enemies is a war of civilization. We can ban any country that is any political party that is against the war. This is a military dictatorship or an oligarchy. Whatever it is, it's not democracy, and yet nobody's really spelling out what this means. How did this takeover occur? How did Europe come, and other countries, Latin America, how did they come to have presidents and an army and what's called the deep state independently in control of government that the voters seem to have no impact on, no ability to say, can't there be a plebiscite on whether to have war or not? Well, the laws of almost every modern democracy say no plebiscite. You can only vote for individuals as head of the party, and these individuals may all have a similar political view about the war and peace. So there's and the economy favoring the financial sector as opposed to the industrial sector. There's the democracy itself has been closed off as a result of this war.
You're pointing to a pretty coherent line of thinking that shows up across multiple theaters: Venezuela, Europe's decoupling from Russian energy, Iran, and even pressure dynamics in the Gulf, where energy is treated less as a commodity market and more as a strategic lever shaping alliances and dependencies. Recent analyses also frame these developments as part of a broader geoeconomic competition, where control over supply routes and exporters indirectly affects China's industrial base and global positioning. Is this actually a unified long-term strategy aimed at restructuring global energy flows, or just a series of overlapping crises that only look coordinated when viewed in hindsight?
Yes, I spelled out that strategy in articles that are on my website quite a few times, and the United States spelled it out. I think 2 weeks into Trump's administration, he said our foreign policy is based on control of oil, and the oil. If we can't control the oil of other countries, we will destroy their oil facilities, so that other countries are not to have any alternative but to depend on our weaponization of the international oil trade so that we can turn off their gas, their oil, their agriculture, and their chemical industry if they do not join the allied side of us against Russia, China, and any of their supporters, such as Iran. So the United States said, all right, to prevent other countries of being alternative sources to oil that would break America's ability to weaponize the oil trade and turn off the spigots for the whole rest of the world, you had, as you just pointed out, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline and the sanctions against trade with Russia. So you've had the same problem now with Venezuela. All right, they first imposed sanctions on Venezuela, and then finally they attacked it and conquered Venezuela, and now all of Venezuela's revenue from the oil trade is paid into a bank account in Florida under the personal direction of Donald Trump and his appointees. And that's what the United States wants to do in Iran. Well, without Russia, Venezuela, and Iran providing independent supplies of oil, the United States will be able to weaponize the oil trade just as it weaponized the grain trade and agriculture by imposing sanctions on exports to China after Mao's revolution in the 1950s. Canada broke that attempted cutoff by selling grain to China. The United States no longer is able to achieve foreign dominance by being an industrial power like it was before, or being a financial power. The only way that the United States can control other countries is by creating chaos, by saying, we will create chaos in your foreign trade and therefore by your industry, just as we did when Trump imposed his tariff policies. And we can agree to soften this chaos that we're causing by you'll agree to join our access of our fight against Russia, China, and any country that is growing and in a way that uses its economic surplus and its financial surplus to promote its own prosperity instead of transferring this surplus to the United States. This is essentially the United States is the new robber baron in the world economy. That is the explicit strategy of the U.S. foreign policy. It was all spelled out last December in America's National Security Strategy report to follow up on Trump's announcement a year and a half ago about that energy is going to be the key to our foreign policy. It's all there in black and white. And other countries somehow have lived in the short run. Europe in particular, as you know, as we've discussed, has just surrendered to the United States demands. And this is crazy. When a country surrenders to the U.S. demands for oil or for anything else, the U.S. just ups the ante. And you had mentioned earlier that Trump has said, well, you know, the United States can end up as the big winner from this cessation of oil trade. The rest of the world will now be in a depression. But we in America are self-sufficient in oil, and we have Venezuela's oil now. We have Canada's oil. We can block the trade for Russian oil through the Arctic by invading Greenland, so that countries can't get to the Arctic from the North Atlantic. You had last week Iceland saying, well, you know, we've been independent for centuries. Maybe we should join the European Union, and the European Union will defend us against America's attempt to not only take over Greenland, but take over Iceland so that it can control the North Atlantic access to the Arctic through Iceland vicinity. You have the whole world aligning itself for this military conflict all around oil. And what's happened is that to keep prices down, the United States has been using the short-term palliative of selling the oil reserve. The oil reserve has not really kept down the oil price in the United States, because almost every barrel of oil that the U.S. Petroleum Reserve has sold into the U.S. market or sold directly to Asian countries, allies, at a discount, has been matched by U.S. exports of natural gas and of oil, the LNG exports. So the United States oil companies have made a bonanza by producing low-priced U.S. gas, U.S. Natural gas and oil at U.S. costs and prices, and selling them abroad. That's basically what Trump meant, and his policy of trying to maintain this oil lever of control over other countries is required not only blocking other countries' use of alternative sources of oil, but alternative sources of energy, wind power, and solar power. So you have Trump has canceled almost all of the U.S. investment programs in windmill power, because that is a rival to oil in the United States, and he represents the oil industry. And he points out, well, the windmill blades are mainly created in China. And China's the beneficiary of wind power. Can't have that. Same thing for solar panels. China is the main manufacturer of solar panels. And so America has essentially fought against the climate change efforts by the Paris Group and by other groups. It's trying to defer Europe from pursuing solar energy wind energy. It's trying to lock Europe into dependency on U.S. LNG and oil exports so that it won't have any alternative at all. Well, of course, China itself has made huge investments in solar energy, especially in its northwestern provinces, including Xinjiang. And so the United States is trying to do its usual mischief in China by trying to promote a separatist movement among the Uyghurs. And the Financial Times today has a long, big read all about how the United States is trying to do that by claiming that this is a fight against Islam. They're trying to play the race card and the religious card. If we can just divide and conquer, if we can divide populations into different ethnic groups, different religious groups, different political groups, then other countries cannot get their act together and have a coherent response to create an alternative to the U.S. national security strategy, which isn't security at all. It's to prevent any other country from having the security and self-sufficiency and independent autonomy from the United States. Other countries must remain dependent on the United States for their oil, for their computer technology, for their internet technology, for their arms, including Europe. All of the European arms, largely from the United States, are subject to the U.S. repairs, U.S. control, U.S. ability to stop the airplanes with all of the control switches that they have. Europe is completely militarily as well as independently and energy dependent on the United States. And any attempt to make Europe either independent or following an ability to have free trade with China and Asia, Russia, Iran, or other countries that are not in the U.S. orbit has been opposed by all of the political parties in power.
It does look like the competition is shifting away from traditional economic strength toward what you might call weaponized interdependence, where energy, technology, finance, and even shipping routes become tools of pressure rather than open markets. The result is a system where access itself becomes the battleground, but also one that increasingly fragments the global economy into competing blocs. Does this actually strengthen the U.S. position relative to its rivals? Or does the disruption eventually undermine the very system that still underpins American influence?
The United States looks at chaos as an opportunity to lock in foreign dependency. If the chaos takes the form of a close down of European and other industries, then the other countries are going to be dependent on the U.S. to somehow rescue them, either by opening the U.S. market to them by subsidies or by just imposing their own client oligarchies and client political parties. You can look at the Christian Democrats under Merz as a client party of the United States. You can look at France under Macron as a U.S. client. You can see certainly Britain under Starmer as a U.S. client. The United States is not averse to saying this is the end of Europe, Western Europe, is any possible industrial competitor for the United States. And essentially, it's as if the United States is saying, if our industry is no longer competitive and we're shut down, we're going to make sure that our trading partners also are non-competitive in order to prevent them from turning to the economies that are still growing with their own self-sufficiency, the trinity of Russia, China, and Iran that's emerging. So the result is going to be other countries in the U.S. orbit are going to have to choose. Are we going to be part of the declining U.S. access, or are we going to try to turn to the part of the world that is not financialized, not under U.S. control, not obliged to turn its economic surplus into U.S. arms purchases for airplanes and missiles that don't work, as we've seen in the fighting against Iran, and they keeping all of their savings in the form of loans to the U.S. Treasury through their Treasury security investments, and America's demand that Germany, Japan, Korea, and other countries relocate their heavy industry, manufacturing and chemicals and computers to the United States. Is Europe going to relocate its industry to the United States, or it seems to so far have been relocating it into China? Well, the important thing is all of this is being relocated outside of Europe. Europe is in effect committing economic suicide as a result of all this. This is, to America, not chaos. This means that Europe is reduced to the same kind of dependency that Latin American countries have been reduced to ever since World War II and the U.S. support of military dictatorships throughout Latin America that essentially ruled by client oligarchies. I'm not sure. For Europe, this requires a political revolution. The result is not going to be simply a rise in oil prices, closing down industry. This close down, this depression is going to have the same effect that depressions have, a political revulsion by saying the current system doesn't work. There must be an alternative. Well, in the past, you could say the Great Depression was pulled out by World War II, but World War II was a fight of armies, of soldiers, and future wars are not going to be a war of armies. They're going to be air wars. They're going to be fights settled by missiles, bombs, and drones, not by invaders. No country has the armed forces that can ever invade another country again. Invasions don't work. You're seeing the problems even that Russia is having in Ukraine for all this. Invasions don't work. All you can do is destroy other countries. Purely destructive war, not invading to create an own new government along Western lines, which are now the old Nazi lines, basically, it turns out.
There's clearly a long-standing pattern of Russian restraint since at least 2014, and it does seem that Moscow now interprets that restraint as having been read in the West as weakness. At the same time, public rhetoric in parts of Europe has become more openly assertive about striking deeper into Russian territory, which changes the psychological and strategic environment. Are we now entering a phase where Russia feels it has to actively reintroduce deterrence through stronger responses? And is there still any political space left in Europe to actually slow this escalation down through dialogue?
Well, one interesting aspect of this, Glenn, which not many people refer to, is that in that extraordinary Q&A that Putin held after the victory celebrations on Red Square, 9th of May, he very clearly differentiated the U.S. from those crazy Europeans, okay? And he said, the U.S. and we, Russians, see Ukraine the same way. Huh? Wow. That's a biggie. That's what he said, okay? So that's the important thing. He's making a distinction between what he sees as Trump's policy, which is destroying NATO, in effect, NATO not having any power without the United States, and the Europeans that are doing these crazy things. Now, again, his primary vision here is to make sure that Trump doesn't do something really stupid, okay? So they see this common thing. Now, Medvedev says, it's crazy to try to negotiate with people that kidnap leaders of countries and all that stuff, but we believe, Medvedev now, we believe the United States is sincere, his word, in trying to tamp down the Ukrainian situation, and that once we get rid of Iran, it'll be possible to work out something sensible. Medvedev. So, what am I saying here? I'm saying here that, number one, NATO is nothing without the United States. They can bluster. They can actually fire long-range drones into deep Russia. And the last one, of course, which killed so many young women in that college there, well, that was a bridge too far for Putin, and Putin retaliated with Oreshniks, for God's sake. Come on, you can't defend against Oreshniks, and it was very clear that he was provoked into doing that. Well, will he be provoked into hitting NATO countries? Well, I don't think so. Why? Well, because this still is Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, and even if there's only a 5% chance, as I read Putin, even if there's only a 5% chance that Trump would irascibly say, but we are part of NATO still, we're going to zap him, he doesn't want to take that chance, okay? So with the Oreshnik strike, I believe that Putin has sort of defused a lot of this popular sentiment that's saying, my God, can't we get this war over? Can't we get it over? And the notion that the Russians are not winning in Ukraine, which is going roundabout, I'm sure, in Norway and Economist, and where did I see it today? Somewhere else, that the Russians are stymied, and that the Russians have no possibility to move forward because of the powerful Ukrainian forces with drones and stuff. Well, with drones and stuff, the Russians have air defense. They have a drone defense. Some of them we get through, but unlike Ukraine, as was just shown with that big Oreshnik attack, unlike Ukraine, they can defend themselves from these missiles. So I used to call them pinpricks, to include the attack on that airfield with bombers, part of the triad. They're no longer pinpricks when they kill, 18 or so young women studying to be teachers in this village here. And so when that happens, Putin retaliates. I don't think that he's going to be too much incited to do more. Now, there have been people, who is it? One of the Russian, was it Karagalov? No, it was Polyansky. Polyansky was the deputy head of the UN mission in New York. I know him. He's now chief Russian representative of the OECD in Vienna. He was interviewed by Danny Davis. And Danny Davis kind of said, well, what he told us was, let me see if that makes it, that it's already too late. It's already too late to avert Russian strikes in Europe. Well, I understand how that can be obfuscated by the next person, and Danny Davis is great. But what Polyansky really said, and I'll read it to you, if Russia is provoked into striking in the future, that's talking about striking against Europe, people will wonder why it happened. But by then, it will have been too late. Now, that's a distinction with a difference there. It will have been, if Russia lets itself be provoked to strike Europe, then Westerners will wonder, well, why does this happen? And then it will have been too late. Now, that's not semantics. That's not pedantry. Will have been is, if I remember correctly, the future perfect tense, okay? It depends on this if, and that's a big if. So, again, if I go back to my frame of reference here, where Putin sees, number one, he's got a guy he can talk to, Number two, he's got a guy he can call up and dissuade from doing really stupid things. He's going to try to prevent a situation where it will have been too late.
There does seem to be a shift in how deterrence is being discussed, with ideas that were once highly taboo, like even the hypothetical use of tactical nuclear weapons, now appearing more frequently in the strategic debate. At the same time, there's this growing argument that restraint may no longer be seen as sustainable if it continues to be interpreted as weakness, especially in the context of NATO's deeper involvement in Ukraine. Are we now approaching a point where the logic of deterrence is being fundamentally rewritten? And how does Germany's current position at the forefront of anti-Russian policy fit into that broader shift?
Glenn, I don't know if I showed you this before, but here's a button here. It says...
yeah.
Yeah, okay. Now, 6 or 7 years ago, I was in Germany on one of my visits, and I saw this. I said, oh, my God. Oh, wow. Get me one of those buttons. I got to put it on here. And my friend said, no, don't do that. Why? Well, because that's a pejorative. For understanding is a pejorative? Yeah, people say you're in Putin's camp. Now, here's sort of a literal manifestation of the mood in Germany. They're very intelligent, cultured people have once again been brainwashed, okay? Their entire media is worse than ours. That's saying something. I don't know how it is in Norway, but most intelligent people who know which end is up in Germany are afraid to speak out, for God's sake. That's how bad it is. Now, that's one thing, and that's bad. But the Germans are going to spend hundreds of thousands of euro on weapons that will not defend them against anyone and risk the social safety net that has made German democracy so secure and so admired around the world? I don't think so. And that's what it will come to. There's a limited amount of money. Merz is as unpopular as any German chancellor in the history of chancellorhood in Germany. He's going to be gone pretty soon. So will Macron, and Stormer is on its way out. These guys are looked on advisedly as superannuated vestiges of what's going to try to hang on as long as they can. So again, cool hand Luke Putin is playing the long game here. He realized, they said, oh, the U.S. has decided not to put intermediate range ballistic missiles in Germany, as they undertook with Chancellor Scholz back at the NATO meeting in Washington 2 years ago. Oh, they're not going to do that anymore. So without the U.S., NATO is nothing, okay? So let's keep calm here. Now, one thing I wanted to mention here is that the Russian equivalent of the CIA, the SVR, okay, has a press office. I didn't know that. Yeah, they made a statement 5 days ago. And what did they say? Well, they were talking about tactics that will significantly reduce the time of approach of these missiles if they're put in Latvia. And Latvia is said to be willing to accept these missiles. And we have, SVR says, 5 sites that they could be fired from. Now, here's the bottom line. It would be useful to recall that the coordinates of decision-making in Riga, in Latvia, are well known, and the country, here it is, the country's membership in NATO will not protect the accomplices of terrorists from fair retribution. Now, this is May 19th, 6 days ago. Very unusual statement, and it's just warning the Latvians, look, if you fire missiles or drones into deep Russia, just realize that your membership in NATO will not protect you from retribution. Now, I haven't kept up on whether the Latvians have taken that seriously or not, but I'm like 80% sure that they will. The retribution sites have been named. The Russians made fun of the Latvians, who, as the Russians say, lack critical thinking. How so? Well, the Ukrainians were able to persuade them that the Russians would never retaliate because they couldn't tell where the missiles come from. That's for I said, we know, we can tell where the missiles come from, so don't do it. Now, that's an example of how the upstart Baltic states would let themselves be drawn into this unless the Russian intelligence service warns the world, look, membership in NATO might not save you from this kind of retaliation. So my prediction is that if this happens, it could be that the Russians could send Oreshnik into a NATO member state, namely Latvia. But I think on balance, that's unlikely because as Putin weighs the relative cost-benefit analysis here, if there's only a 5% chance, there's only a 5% chance that Trump would go off half-cocked and say, no, Article 5, I never rescinded Article 5, I want to hear what we're going to do. Even if there's just a 5% chance of that, it's not worth, the game is not worth the candle. Now, take that for what it's worth. Many of my colleagues disagree. When Karaganov or Medvedev, these people speak out, well, they've been saying this for a long, long time, Karaganov especially, forever. And yeah, Karaganov can interview Putin at these big meetings at Marandi and elsewhere, but I never had the example or the thought that Karaganov was fully persuasive with Putin. I'm persuaded that Putin is too cautious for that kind of thing. And I may be completely wrong, but I do adduce 6 decades of watching Russians and Soviet leaders. And this one is different. I will say this, we should be grateful for his caution, for his perspicaciousness, and for his foresight in developing the kind of relationship with Beijing, with Xi personally. Let's add one thing here. When Putin was leaving Beijing, Xi walked with him, and the camaraderie, the closest sort of, Xi is a little bit inscrutable, right? Doesn't smile much, but this time it was almost a smile. They're standing next to each other, and Putin is waiting. Oh, what's going to happen here? Will he give me the great big bear hug that Trump advertised was going to be given to him when he went and never got? And he's standing there, and then she goes like this.
It does seem like we're in one of those classic escalation points, where both sides continue to push pressure while publicly rejecting the idea of backing down. And historically, those moments often either lead to a shock that forces reassessment, or to a managed return to diplomacy at the last possible stage. Are today's European leaders actually capable of making that pivot toward negotiation before the crisis deepens further? Or has the political momentum already moved too far in the direction of confrontation?
Well, it takes two to tango, right? It takes two to make war. One final thought is this. As you know, I came down to Washington under John F. Kennedy, and just 2 months after I joined the CIA, he made that wonderful speech at American University, 10 June 1963. And one of the things he said there was, look, unique among great powers, Russia and the United States have never been in a frontal war one against the other. Now, bear in mind, this is 8 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when it almost happened, okay? When you and I might not be making this nice little discussion today. So he said, look, the thing we have to avoid at all costs, given what almost happened 8 months ago, we have to avoid the possibility of challenging another nuclear armed country with a choice between humiliating retreat and using nuclear weapons. My God. Okay. Now, Khrushchev was himself chastened and wondering about how this all went down and made the right decisions. Thank the Lord, right? But since then, ever since then, up until Ukraine, when the U.S. took it into its head, Biden and the rest of them, to challenge a nuclear-armed power by moving Ukraine into NATO, that's when this all changed, okay? So you're right, Glenn. This is a new shift, and it's happened. Now, the question is, do the Russians have the upper hand in Ukraine to the degree that they're really not worried too much about these pinpricks, or even, well, they will retaliate from killing a whole bunch of girls in a school? But are they willing to kind of attrit the Ukrainian forces and defend themselves against these drones, a defense that the Ukrainians do not have against drones, and bide their time and see how long it takes mouths to fall, Macron, a Stormer, and the U.S., for the nonce, is pretty much on the side of Russia on this, and Putin has said explicitly that in that 9/11, at that 9 May press conference. One ought to read that. It's full of gems, also having to do with Ukraine. I mean, also having to do with Iran.